Hello, my name is Miguel Neves, and I am the editor-in-chief of EventMB, and you're listening to the Event Manager podcast. On this episode, I get to speak to one of my favorite people in the industry, Tahira Endean, and I'm joined by the deputy editor of EventMB, Monorchio. We talked to Tahira about various different things, like scary life changes and how sharing those inspires others. We talked to her about joining the dark side with her short stint on the event tech side of the industry. We talked to her about writing about virtual and hybrid events before they were a big thing, before the pandemic. We talked to her about intentional event design, which is the title of this episode and also the title of her book that she released in 2007. We talked about how face-to-face creates richer conversations, how not to write a book, which I think is a fascinating topic. We talk about industry designations, which she holds 4 of, which I think is high up there. I've seen people with more, but that's pretty high. We talk about designing a 15-hour marathon virtual SITE NITE all-nite event, which just happened recently. And we talk about the future of incentive travel. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Hello, Tahira. Thank you so much for joining us, being our guest on the Event Manager podcast. For those that don't know you, this is Tahira Endean. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Tahira Endean? I mean, everybody knows you, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
First of all, who is this everybody? I feel like I'm so lucky because I do have colleagues and friends around the world. So I feel like I know lots of people, but everybody feels like a bit of a stretch. So Tahira, let's see. I am a Vancouver-based event designer who has been doing this for 20, like a really long time. Let's just go with that. I love chocolate. I would say that I am an alligator wrestler, meaning that if you have a problem that's really hard to solve, bring me in and I will probably help you solve that problem. And I love anything with bubbles.
That sounds good to me. And you've also been named in the top 5 women in event technology a while back. You're a top 20 trendsetter in meetings today. You've got a lot of accolades there. I think very illustrious.
My new favorite one is Smart Meetings Visionary. I was just like, ooh, that's a good one. I'll try and live up to that.
Awesome. But I know that your career didn't start in events, right? You had another career before that, and I'd love to just share that story because I think it's a great story of kind of reinvention, and go into as much or little detail of it as you want.
It's interesting to me. I had a call recently from Richard Aaron, who really does everybody knows Richard Aaron, founder of BizBash, and he's teaching a master's program at NYU. And he is using my book, Intentional Event Design, to teach his master's class. And we'd never met. So he contacted me to say thank you, which was really nice. And then invited me to his class where people were using the six of the 7 intentions to map an event design and presenting that. And that was really fun to watch. But what he said to me was that at the beginning of the book, I tell this story that I'm going to tell you. And he said that many of the women, particularly in the class, connected to it because as we hit points in our lives where we have to make changes, it can be really scary. And sometimes just knowing that someone else has done it makes it less scary. So I was a hairstylist. I loved. I wanted to do it since I was 6 years old. By the time that I was 15, I was taking beauty culture in high school. I graduated with my high school diploma and as a fully licensed hairstylist. And I managed a hair salon and I had a great team and I was working for a manufacturer and on an amazing trajectory. And then I started not being able to actually use my arms at work. I would be cutting hair and my hands would go numb. And it took about probably 9 or 10 months to figure out that it wasn't just something simple. It was something complicated, which was that I'd actually been born with an extra rib. So it's called thoracic outlet syndrome. But what was happening was 2 things. One is that as soon as my arms were about 45 degrees out from my body, there was no blood going to them. So, of course, holding them up made them not work at all. And then I eventually, when they did the surgery, they found that there was the on each side, 2 separate surgeries, but the ribs had actually grown together. And so that meant that they were had crushed the nerves. So what I have is ongoing permanent nerve damage in my arms that when I sat down with the surgeon post-surgery and he said, "You'll never cut hair again," I just went home and cried for a couple of days. And my then boyfriend was just like, "It's okay. We're going to get through this. I love you." And I was like, "It doesn't matter." So 32 years later, we're still married. So it's worked out, but it led me to change. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I thought that this little tiny postage size stamped ad in our local newspaper that said Event and Convention Management Diploma, brand new program, sounded so glamorous and exciting. And so I got into that. And that was very exciting to be able to do that. And I'm probably one of the few people that went to university for something and then continued doing it. And I had a great practicum, actually, with Claire Smith, another well-known person in the event industry, at the Vancouver Convention Center. And we're still friends. We're going to go walk her dog on the weekend. But it was a really great transition. And I couldn't imagine now having not had this career as well.
That's amazing. What a great story of resilience. And I think a lot of people find the industry from different angles, but I think that one is unique. I don't think anybody else I know has that particular angle. And then you've worked in lots of different things, right? You've essentially been an event designer, but you did go over to the dark side at one point. You
go to the dark side.
Yes.
Everybody's going to the dark side now. Like, I feel like I maybe set the trend. I don't know. But now I'm back.
You were like, 8 years ahead of everybody else, right? I just wanted, when we saw it, the dark side, you worked for Quick Mobile, I believe, for a couple of years.
Which has now been absorbed into Cvent. Yeah.
And I just want to, well, first of all, this whole thing about calling it the dark side is funny, but I just want to, I guess, explore that or poke that a little bit. But what made you do that? And was it so dark on that side?
No, it was great on that side. So for me, I have done a lot of things. So I've been a PCO. I have worked at a DMC. I've been in an incentive agency, and at that time I was on my second round of being I was creative director at a DMC, and fantastic, loved it. Except I thought, I really, after 5 years of doing this, if I have to do one more event with a Mountie in it, I will probably poke my eyes out. And at that time, I actually I didn't have an interview about a job. I had an interview about technology and how it could fit into a program. And from that, I was recruited at Quick Mobile. And it was a great journey. And what it really forced me to do, that I'm so thankful for now, is to really deep dive into technology and its possibilities. And not just from the perspective of Quick Mobile, but of every technology that could impact. And led us to creating, we created Event Camp, and we explored what technology would look like and what hybrid would look like. And, as everybody started talking about hybrid and virtual being so new, people started to remind me that I'd written quite a lot about hybrid and virtual 4 years ago, based on information from 6 years before. So the transition, when we had to pivot, although my day job now is working for the Society for Incentive Travel Excellence, meaning travel, when we had to pivot to virtual, it didn't scare me because we knew how to do it. So it's, and I love now, there's so many amazing platforms out there, and seeing people that we know who have so much talent and so much knowledge, creating new platforms and really extending their reach deeper into what those platforms can do is just, it's wonderful to see.
Very interesting. And I remember you had a really interesting dilemma when you were working at Quick Mobile, which was you were organizing events for them. Mm-hmm. So you were a planner, but nobody would accept that because your email was Quick Mobile. So everybody assumed that you were sort of a supplier in the industry. And you're like, but I'm booking venues, I'm planning events, I am a client, but that must have felt a bit weird. Do you think that's, I don't know, something that needs fixing?
It's probably what drove me back. So it's a challenge because there's many technology companies in the world that have very huge event and marketing departments, and those people really are planning some of the biggest company, most events in the world. I was listening to a different podcast because there's more than one out there, but it was a woman from Google, and how many events they do per year? Want to guess, just for fun?
A few thousand, probably.
65,000.
That's a little more than I would expect.
So just because somebody has a @technology company address, whether it is an event supplier or a larger technology company, we're doing events. There's a lot of events that are happening out there, and so we need to be able to differentiate that a bit better. It was very challenging for me because I had identified even as a DMC, I was buying millions of dollars a year in services. So it was very challenging for me to be, I was surprised actually at how badly we treat our technology partners, because honest to God, we need you, and we need to treat you like the gold that you are, whether any partner, for me, it doesn't matter if it is a hotel, a caterer, a decor company, a technology company. I can't do an event alone. I can't do any of those things. So I really rely on those partnerships. But it turns out that I think what happens is that sometimes when it feels like it's too much of a sales relationship, buyers start, let's call them buyers because that's what we call them in the industry, put up some barriers that are perhaps unnecessary and don't necessarily lead us to be as successful as we could be if we were really looking at it as a partnership.
That's really interesting. Do you feel that that's changed at all now as
No.
we're in this pandemic period? No. So tech providers, you feel, are still kind of bottom of the food chain, for the lack of a better expression?
I don't think they're the bottom of the food chain. I think now they're the big scary beast that might eat you, because we don't understand them. They feel expensive because it's not a cost we're used to. Nobody questions that my lunch is going to cost $70, pick your currency, plus 23% service charge, plus 8 to 10% tax, making my $70, pick your currency lunch $100, pick your currency. But we do question that there's a $7 per person charge on a technology. So it's really about how are we rebudgeting and thinking about, for anything, it's go back to, so how I approach events is people-centric, purpose-driven. Is the technology going to allow my participants to have the experience that they need to achieve the objectives that my stakeholders have? And if it is, then that's probably where my money's going to need to go to be spent. So, we're in an interesting dilemma with that right now.
I think you raised a really interesting point about the concept of expense and how people reconcile themselves to the value of different things. Given that, you might have a $7 per person expense for technology when just the food and beverage aspect of an in-person event is in the hundreds, what do you think that will mean in terms of the longevity of virtual events and the potential for them to replace certain kinds of in-person experiences?
So there's a few things that I think about that. So first of all, I think that there is nothing that is a faster route to success than face-to-face when it's done well, because that is where we have those serendipitous conversations you simply don't have digitally. But I think that there is a lot of opportunity to look at the events that you're doing and determine, am I really providing top-down information at this time where I just need to deliver a message? Great. That is perfect for a digital event. Do that. Use that. Expand your reach, blow that up. But, when you're looking for really deeper dive, collaboration, innovation, moving things forward and giving people a little bit more time to do that, because the other thing with a live event is once you step into that space, you're in that space. Whereas in a digital event, you tend to be more distracted. And we do need to compress information for digital spaces. So it's about taking your spend and spending it in places that make sense. And now that there's so many great digital platforms that, do allow us to have fun. We can go and we can play games and connect with each other. We can go into breakout rooms, although it's not quite the same as being at a round table live, you can still create those interactions. And again, when you're just delivering information to people, they don't need to travel for 2 days to just go and have information delivered to them. You can deliver that in very meaningful, still emotive ways through video now. So it's going to be about choosing the best way to spend to meet your purpose. And I don't think it goes back to that. Why do we have that event? Well, because we always have that event. Great. So it requires us to be a little bit more thoughtful, and we don't always get the time and space to step back and be strategic in that. So it's a whole bunch of levels of understanding that have to happen.
That's really interesting. And I kind of wonder about the collaborative aspect, especially now as everyone has moved to a work from home context. I mean, most people I know anyway, are working from home now, in our industry and in most sort of like non-retail oriented industries. Do you think that the ability to collaborate effectively virtually could just be a matter of training, as now most people's like daily jobs happen remotely?
Yes and no. So, I have successfully planned multiple events this year collaboratively with teams across the world. Our executive team for SITE is across the globe. Your team is across the globe. So we do know how to do it, and we know how to still create effective outcomes from that. But it's not, I feel like I'm going to have less, I know I have had less memorable, laugh out loud conversations online than we would ever have had in all of, and Miguel and I are a good example of this, in that, we have never lived in the same city. We see each other at very odd touch points over the course of a decade. But we could still remember conversations that we've had about, I'm going to use the example of breakfast, and how that ties into developing a relationship that can become a relationship based on more trust, that allows us to then bridge those next steps for collaboration. So it's possible for sure. And I've worked on a very successful project for the last year that kind of saved my sanity, with people that I've never sat down in a room with. And there's 4 of us, and the 3 of them only actually sat down. They all live in New York for the first time last week together. And then told me afterwards so I wouldn't be jealous. So it's, and that is and even they said, we didn't have a different conversation, but we were able to have a richer conversation because we were face to face. And, I'm not going to say that's going to save our industry, because that's not our industry now is, with 7 billion people and more limited travel options. We need digital and virtual in order for the world to continue, because people still need to have information, education, and conversation. So, and it's a way to do it.
As things move into hybrid, do you think that it would make sense for people to do that sort of top-down information gathering aspect of things virtually, like in a virtual component, and then reserve the in-person experience for the collaborative aspect, so that you don't end up using the time that you're spending in person for that classroom setting, one-to-many kind of dissemination of information?
Yeah, I think that's the ideal scenario, honestly. But I think that that's been the ideal scenario since hybrid has been around, which is, solidly more than a decade. It's just, we're not really good at that. We're not good at asking people to, hey, watch this video and read this book before you come to this meeting so that we can have a meaningful conversation. And whether you apply that to a board meeting or how do we build the next great spaceship meeting, sometimes getting people to do things ahead so that you can have a richer conversation can be a challenge, just because we all have limited resources of time being the biggest.
That particular model doesn't require hybrid necessarily, right? That can just be, here's some great content. Make sure you consume this before you come to the meeting, and then make the most of the time at the meeting. I think
that's definitely true. Hopefully, as we get better at designing content specifically for consumption online, as people within the event industry sort of learn that skill set and develop that, it'll be easier to navigate that. I also wanted to know what you think about, I thought what you said about serendipity and that as a boon of meeting in person I'm curious to know what you make of those like 3D environments that try to replicate, try to replicate the experience of moving through a 3D environment in moving through an in-person environment,
a convention center, that kind of thing.
Space. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when they work well, they're awesome. When they don't work well, when it's glitchy to get in, when you bump into somebody but then it doesn't let you into the video chat, it can be as frustrating as standing outside of a circle of people you want to talk to live. But when they work, they're great, and I think that I really like that feeling of, look, I've moved through this space without a glass of wine in my hand, but moved through this space virtually with that sort of mentality. And then I found friends I wouldn't have found otherwise because I didn't even know they were here. Oh my God, it's so amazing to see you. It can be, that is something that as those continue to evolve, I think will be really good. And I think, we've had some really good examples of using not even the 3D ones that you're speaking of, but also even just 2D video networking, but where you're sort of randomly placed with people. And one of my favorites was from our global conference this year. One of our board members, so we were doing sort of 2 or 3 rounds of 4-minute networking. And so he got to me on maybe his 3rd round. He's like, oh my God, I just got an RFP. So, you don't know how they're going to always work, but sometimes they work really successfully like that. So it's, there's good opportunities.
So I wanted to just make sure we mention the book that you wrote, The Intentional Event Design, 2017. Tell us a little bit about it. And I wonder if you could think, is what you wrote more relevant today than ever? Or did it age well, I guess is probably what I'm asking. And how does the pandemic kind of reflect on it?
Yeah, when I wrote, here's how not to write a book. I was looking for something I'd written. I couldn't find it. I thought, this is really annoying that I can't find something that I've written. I'm going to put what I think is important about events, arrogantly, into one book. Not so arrogantly, because that's not really how I think. But somebody said to me really snarkily, well, to have a book, you have to have 50,000 words. I was like, okay. In my head, I was like, that's a lot of words. I have no idea what that means. So here's how not to write a book. Take everything you've written in the last 2 years and dump it into a Word document to see how many words it is, which was about 80,000. Then take out all of the stuff that you don't ever want to speak about or be the expert on. So then you're left with like a lot less words. And that's where I started. And I sent it to a friend. And she said, it's really good. She goes, but my brain hurts. Like, you need to make it friendlier. You need to tell more stories. You need to maybe map it out a little bit differently. And that's where I took it and gave it 6-7 intentions. And, it's definitely not, it's not a beginner book. It's not your checklist book. It is really designed for someone who has been doing events for a while, or is at their nation stages, but really wants to understand how to design better for the human experience. So it's really about, it looks at how do we take time for design? How do we embed technology? And the technology is AI to wearables. It's not, here's how to use a specific technology. It's when your client says, I want a chatbot, you need to know what a chatbot is. I looked at the different and evolving roles and, how we need to have digital producers. And so it surprisingly was ahead of its time in that way and is super current. I mentioned my Richard Aryan experience earlier, and he called it prescient. And then I had to go look up what that means. But it's, but he looked for 6 months for a book that he could use to teach a master's in event management class. And this is what he found, is that it covers off what is happening today. There's I only put 6 checklists in. One is emotive words. One is hybrid events. So it talks about how to bring your brain to a meeting. I'm a big advocate of the most people you should have at around or 6, because otherwise you can't have a good conversation with an entire table. It turns out that actually, if they're sitting 6 feet apart, probably 4 people are going to have a great conversation. So it's actually turning out to be more relevant. I went back to look to say, should I what do I need to update based on right now? And of course, there's always going to be things to update. But what I actually realized is that it's in a good place. So I'm not going to write about how to put people 6 feet apart and wear masks, because we have 4,000 articles on that. So
I think if your writing is always about concepts and ideas and thinking about things, and to me that doesn't really get dated, right? I mean, the examples might get a little dated, or whatever you're using, the tools you're using might be a little dated, but good design thinking doesn't get dated as far as I know. And I've got the book on the shelf. It's on my list of books that I definitely refer to. So it's good to hear. And now you're working for SITE, the Society of Incentive Travel Excellence. You have 4 different acronyms and after your name, which is really interesting. I have to admit, I don't know what all of them mean. I also have CMP and DS after my name if I wish, but there's also CED and CITP after your name. What do those mean? And I think at least one of them is connected to SITE, so forgive me if I don't know exactly all the things.
So CITP is our Certified Incentive Travel Professional designation with SITE, and it's essentially the meeting planner. Like CMP is for meeting planners, the CITP really is for a more senior incentive travel professional. It was a really hard exam. I'm not going to lie. I just wrote it last September, and it was like it's good because it pushes you to think about, as writing your CMP pushes you to think about all aspects of meetings. It pushed us to think about all aspects of that. The CED is probably one of my favorite, which is the Certified Event Designer. So there is less than 200 CEDs in the world. And that's the program that came out of Ruud Janssen and Roel Friesen and Dennis Lucher and the work that they did with the Event Design Handbook. And we see that quite a lot around the industry. It's one of those designations where a lot of people start it but don't finish it. Because it's about a 6-month process. But it really is about that design thinking and prototyping and testing things. And, certainly in my role with SITE this year, we've tested and pushed everything. It was when I took this job, I knew it was going to be hard. I report to 2 boards. So I report to 30 people, essentially, who all have opinions on what successful events look like and who all are very seasoned. They've got great ideas. They're great people to bounce things off of. But it took a year to gain trust, and to be able to really start to basically imprint some of the things that I believe about events, and how they need to be sustainable, they need to be thoughtful, they need to create and promote spaces for dialogue, they need to provoke thought, we need to take risks with our content, and when we did our global conference in Vancouver at the beginning of 2020, so a full sort of year into the job, it was really successful, and they really saw like, oh yeah, this is good, this can work. We did crazy things like put a breakout in the middle of the foyer with people with headsets on, and every hotel salesperson was like, oh my God, I have a new way to sell breakouts. So we're really able to just test and push ideas. And then, of course, pandemic happened almost immediately after that. And so when we had to flip to digital, having my DES digital event strategist, which I didn't do last week, I did it 6 years ago, I think. So again, something that I really understood this space, but then all of a sudden we had all these new and exciting platforms to play with, which has been really fun.
And was the boards around you, were they scared? How did they take it?
Yeah, because they were all trying to do it in their own businesses too. And how hard it was those first 4 to 6 months of people trying to figure out how to do virtual. So, and for many of them, they, like I said, everyone has a senior job that they're good at. And then you have to all of a sudden learn this new skill and sell your clients on a new idea, and Dylan, your questions around, what are we doing? What makes sense right now is we had to all learn that together. The reason I keep these letters up on my Zoom is just to make, to just create a little comfort that it's okay, because I know what I'm doing, and I'm not always going to get it right. We're going to make lots of mistakes. The last thing we just did was
I wanted to ask you about that 15-hour event. And I think I would kind of just remark saying, I see a trend in events getting shorter and more condensed. And you also talked about producing things tighter and more, short periods of time. Why do a 15-hour event? And, how did it work out?
Question. So it was to replace SITE NITE Europe. So SITE NITE Europe and SITE NITE North America are events that we typically do 2-hour events or 3-hour events. And they're a fundraiser for our foundation. And we did them both digitally last year, and they were 2-hour events. And what I realized after we had done our global conference, where we applied all of those shorter content principles and shorter durations and all of those things in January, when I
this was online, you mean the latest global conference online?
Yeah. So our latest global conference is online, and followed all those good practices and principles, and made sense and worked really well. And then when we got to IMEX Frankfurt canceling, I'm lying in bed thinking, like, good God, what are we going to do? And I thought, well, a 2-hour event is not going to work. And it's not going to work because we have chapters on 6 continents across every time zone. And you'll never find a time that works for 2 hours. And more what I thought was, this pandemic is not over. And it's not going to be over in April as much as we all wish and will it to be. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about SITE is that it's a very strong community. We have lots of members who are plus 20 years. But what we also have is members who really support each other and who are kind to each other and need each other, especially now. And so the only way to touch them was to do what started out as a 12-hour event. And so I called it SITE NITE All Night, although that was only all night for some people.
It was definitely all night for you, because I think you started at 1 a.m. your time?
It's really early for me. Yeah, 4 a.m. for me, noon in London, So then our team was in Istanbul, so that we worked with to produce it. So we were never on the same time zone. And so the idea was that we have 28 chapters. Everybody got 15 minutes of fame. And I said, don't send me a destination video. We've all seen them. I said, send me extraordinary people sharing extraordinary stories from extraordinary places. If you want to show us how you would do an incentive trip at the Taj Mahal, take your kids. If you want to show us how you cook an amazing Mexican meal, bring your mom. Because we work with people, and let's tell the stories of our people. And they did, and it was fantastic. But as we started to put in the content, and we were able to develop some really brave, wonderful content around DEI, around women in leadership, around technology, and weave that through. So everything that happened was 2 minutes to 15 minutes long, and then we brought in 3 great hosts, one DJ, and then Garrett and Sky, who both brought, a unique energy to the event and helped us tell the stories and weave everything together. And for me, the whole time flew by. I'll tell you, the first video that came in was from our China chapter, and they were going to be the opening video to the event. They opened their video with Wuhan.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, let's do this. You know what? We're going to tell a story of what it looks like right now in our world and where we're getting to. And they closed their video with a really unique location in China that most people outside of China would never have been to, and some of the things you would experience on a program there. And it was excellent. It was 14 hours by the time we mapped it out. It ended up being 15 hours. So my lesson was, if you're going to do a really long telethon event with no breaks, because I thought people are adults, I don't need to build in breaks, they can figure themselves out. And
turns out they don't.
No, they were. It turns out that I thought so. My metric for success was 100 people on for the entire time. We had between 175 and just over 200 on for the entire time, and we had people who came on thinking that they'd watch for 15 minutes and stayed for 6 hours. Our Australia chapter, they said, SITE NITE all night. Like, great, it's all night for us. We're not going to be up all night. I was like, fair enough, because we also have 3 hours for you from 8 till 11 in the morning, that you're going to be able to come on and see the newest research and there'll still be people around from SoCal and Texas and, places like that. And because for them it's 4 p.m. And the woman who said that got on at 9 p.m, went to bed at 2:30 in the morning, and was back up at 8. So, it was just, people stayed, they talked, they chatted, they danced, they played. It was just really, really fun to see it happen, and the time flew by, and we laughed the whole time. Our crew was just laughing the whole time because it was just really fun. So would I do it again? God, no. I hope we go back to live events that are 15 hours long. But did it work for building the community, which was the metric that we had? And yeah, it really, really did.
Well, it sounds like you have a ton of great content that came out of that event. Mm-hmm. And I mean, granted, 15 hours, even the shows that I love binging, I don't know that I could sit there for 15 hours and watch them. But I wonder where that content lives now. Is that content on demand now? And
it is.
Being able to incorporate it into your other programming and campaigns?
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of the ones, especially the DE&I and the Women in Leadership, we actually pulled excerpts out to use for SITE NITE, because when we started to record those, they ended up becoming longer content. So I pulled out 4 to 12-minute excerpts to use, but all that content is now online on the SITE YouTube channel, and it's fantastic. The stories, like, I laughed, I cried, I had chills. I mean, it was really good content. So I felt incredibly proud of every member who contributed, mostly members, but everyone who contributed to the content, because they took risks. With Dee and I, we worked with the team at Accor, and we had an interview with Kendall Gender, who represents the Fairmonts in Vancouver, and who talked about being your authentic self in drag, which was great. And then we had a woman who told stories of traveling with her now 22-year-old daughter, who's missing part of her 5th chromosome. So she'll always be a little bit like 5 years old. And some of the experiences that she's had because of that. And it's just really, it made us really think about how we need to be more empathetic in life and in work. And that's what we do. We say with especially incentive travel, but any travel, that, it's building and bridging cultures through transformative travel. There's what's going to change us, and it's why we miss travel. And it's really special.
Well, that sounds, in some sense, it sounds quite evergreen. How have you seen viewership of that content?
We've just launched it on demand. So we've just launched it. So yeah, there's definitely, it's just gone out really through our membership. So, but people are going back and watching it. And the feedback is really positive. And, we'll continue to have it out there and to use it. And we'll continue to build on those themes going forward, because those are, unfortunately, in many ways, those are evergreen themes. We need to think about how we are empathetic and equitable going forward.
Yeah. I wanted to touch a little bit on the incentive travel side. I think it goes without saying that the pandemic has been a tough time for any incentive travel company. I see a lot of companies doing the virtual site visit, that kind of thing, but obviously that's not generating the kind of income that they would do with real events. But how do you see the future of incentive travel? We're at this stage where we don't know exactly how it's going to work after the pandemic. We have, on one side, we see the future of work kind of question. Our office is coming back. You could argue that incentive travel would be more important than ever to bring people together because they're all working from home. But at the same time, I also see this tendency for people to want to be quite relaxed at work and work in different ways. And I have this feeling that when I go to a really unique place to travel, I want to be there with my wife. I want to be there with my family. I don't know if I want to be there with, the stereotypical Bob from accounts or whatever it is. Like, I don't know if that's the type of experience that I want to do if I get to do something really amazing. How do you see that? And, is there a kind of a balance there somewhere?
Yeah, I think, all those things you said are so correct. So I think for me, honestly, the most successful incentive travel programs we see are ones where somebody can share them with somebody who's significant to them. And so having, an incentive program where you're with just Bob from accounting, those still happen for sure, but they're going to be slightly different. And I think as we travel is going to be that new luxury, because you're going to have a different kind of passport and you're going to have to follow different rules, and it's going to be a little bit more inconvenient for a while. But we all know that when we get somewhere new, to be able to experience it, especially when you can personalize it and have, a greater variety of options, and you're not just sort of shepherded in large groups from place to place, but can go and experience things with people that you like or love. And that is been given to you as a reward, I think is really critical. One of the things we're looking to do right now is to figure out how do we find those people out there who've had those and you're doing this in different ways too, Miguel, but how do we find the people out there who have been transformed by a meeting or incentive travel experience, and hear more of those stories, because we know anecdotally they happen all the time. When I said I couldn't imagine not having this career, what I couldn't imagine is not having the travel and the amazing opportunities that have come with this career. And when we can take people places and open their minds and their hearts to new cultures and watch that happen, that's why we do this. We do this because we want to see people enjoying what they do.
Well, I'm sure from a company's perspective, a large part of the rationale for incentive travel trips and corporate retreats is, as much as we would like to go to those places with our loved ones, the point in many cases is for people to be able to connect with their coworkers and bond with them and have a more meaningful connection with them. And I suspect that for a lot of those coworkers who don't build luxury trips to Iceland into their annual expenditures, having that be on the company's dime is a huge incentive that they might be able to enjoy destinations that they wouldn't otherwise have access to.
It is a huge incentive. And I think, and there's lots of research that we've done, and the joint research that we've done with the Incentive Research Foundation and with FICP, the Financial and Insurance Conference Planners Association, shows that, 100%, and then anecdotally, I talked to someone this week who last year their company gave them, instead of their, the year before they'd had a trip to Mykonos, this year they were given $25,000 in stocks and shares. And so she renovated her kitchen, and she's like, I love my new kitchen. She goes, I would have rather been in Greece. That trip had a lot more meaning. And the power of incentive travel is well documented. I think the first trip was like a train trip across the US in 1911 was the first recorded incentive trip. So it's not a new idea, but when it's used well, it's extremely powerful.
Interesting. Great. And I think we're kind of starting to wrap up. I have two kind of questions that I'd like to ask you here to wrap up. And I'll ask them both, so maybe you can think about them while I'm asking. One is any kind of technology or innovation that you have an eye on that maybe is coming out now or that you're seeing in the future that could be really exciting. And the other is we love to ask our guests who we should interview next on the podcast. So we'd love to have a recommendation from you as a next guest that we should have on the podcast.
Oh my goodness. There's so many people you should have next.
We'll try to get through all of them, but we're just asking right? for one as to kind of get that serendipity going.
Yes. So from a technology perspective, what I like is that there is just such robust community building abilities now in the platforms that are coming out, and we're getting better at using them, and the data isn't going to go away. So there's not one specific one. I would say more the category of technology would be anything that can tie people together in a way that allows them to feel more connected when they are working from home.
So that community platforms over event platforms necessarily, or not necessarily instead of, but that kind of sense of using a platform as to hold a community.
Yeah. I think that that's, at the end of the day, we're people who are watching these things. So as much as we want good content, we want to be connected to other people. But that's just my opinion. People to interview.
From someone who's been on the dark side and has come back, I think it's always valid to get your opinion.
Yes. It's always what we wrestle with, right? Is how do we build community? There's so many people to talk to.
Who would you like to interview?
Who would I like to interview? Do you know who I think would be super fun to interview is Kevin White. I did a planning in a pandemic course with him at the end of last year, and he actually made that fun. But he always makes me think a little bit differently. And, other people that do that are, Rude always makes me think differently. You always make me think differently. Anthony Vade always makes me, pushes things. And then probably my very favorite, if I was picking one person, I'm going to pick one person for you, is Andrew LaCanienta. And Andrew is a PhD in experience design who teaches at Cal Poly. His class presented to our young leaders last year ideas for creating their conference that completely shifted their thinking. And that was student presentations. He is fundamentally one of the people who is changing the approach to events at a student level, which gives me so much hope for the future of event design.
Great. Very powerful. Yep. We'll definitely invite Andrew and all the other people you mentioned. You have a list of maybe 5 or 6 there. So we'll try to invite everybody, and hopefully they'll want to come and have a chat with us. Tahira, thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's really a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and it's been a pleasure to have you as a friend. And I hope you listen to the podcast, tell everybody about it. And I wish you all the best with all the events at SITE and anything else that you do. I think you're going to be very successful. So my deep appreciation for you being with us today.
Well, thanks, Miguel and Dylan, for having me. It was enjoyable to be here. It doesn't even feel like it's 6 a.m.
Good stuff. Thank you very much. So today we are joined by an extra guest, Nick Borelli from All Seated is here with us. Nick, thank you for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to have you with us in this episode.
Yeah, thanks. I'm super excited to be part of in any way to be part of this podcast series. It's got just a killer lineup of the smartest people. So to find any way to wiggle into that is certainly my pleasure.
Awesome. And we just heard from Tahira Endean, the head of events at SITE, who shared with us a really insightful episode about the intentional event design, or that's sort of the bigger title that we're talking about. And I know you were listening in, Nick, and I wanted you to pick out kind of your bits that really kind of rang true with you. And I think you're also, in a similar way to Tahira, you've also moved over to the quote unquote dark side, right? Is that something you'd like to unpack with us a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Tahira did that, and it was at a time where I think prior to the post-COVID tech boom, so to speak, that we've had, she was kind of a big part of the, I guess the last time that happened, like almost 10 years prior to that, when technology and the apps were becoming something that was not just a novelty, but almost a requisite, really heralding that era in. And I remember the content that she was working on, and I was just like, wow, what a smart move to be able to have somebody with a network, with authority, as opposed to someone exclusively from the tech space who not only doesn't speak the language, also everyone's guards up. So, I mean, she definitely is the herald of what this era has seen more and more of, which is accelerated trust due to bringing on people who already have that.
And do you feel
Definitely.
like that's sort of what you're bringing to All Seated? It kind of sounds autobiographical.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously I see the parallels, right? And I'm, maybe I'm vicariously putting some of that in there, but I follow Tahira, period. And that move, in the back of my mind was one that was like really smart. I think that if I'm doing anything smart, I don't know, but I know where I'm able to do the most good right now. And honestly, like the bridging the gap between live events and virtual events, in as much as not necessarily just the technology, but the empathy. That's something that I think that I am intentionally trying to bridge. You know, even as much as like the time that I've spent over the last few years has been much based around the idea of building personas, both for B2B within the events industry and also attendee personas with some of the work I've been doing over the years with Merits. And that's all rooted in empathy. So, and I think that that's maybe one of the missing components and why there's this concept of the dark side. I think that tech hasn't come in as a disruptor empathetically. It's come in a disruptor as a disruptor, you know, like it's Darwinian, like we're here, so you should embrace us. And live events has said, well, hold on here. We don't want to embrace anything that isn't at the heart of what we like, which is in my opinion, hospitality, people, humanity, you know, all the things that its perception of it. So it guards up, and tech doesn't understand guards up. It just understands we're better, so embrace us.
Really interesting.
They're sort of delivering their tech like the Sermon on the Mount, kind of like, why aren't you following?
Yeah,
this is so much better.
It's just, yeah, exactly. Like eye for an eye, guys. You know, it's not really that great. Like there's better opportunities. Yeah, why doesn't that sell itself? The reality is that you have to have a base that really wants it, right? And I don't know if I've heard this in a couple conversations already. I don't know necessarily if event professionals have always wanted technology. I think they've wanted and protected the thing that they believe is their special thing, which is, you know, that humanness, a lot of the intangibles. And I think that that's fought against the wholesale embrace of data at the level it should have been years ago. I think it's relegated event people to a silo outside of a sales and marketing of their own doing. And also think they're right too. There is something special about live events, and there is something intangible. It's just very difficult in a world where I have money to spend as a marketer, and I have to look at where I can get my ROI and where I can get my return. And I can prove to my CMO on a spreadsheet that this digital marketing tactic works. And this live event, I go, it works. You know, it's hard to get on the spreadsheet. Even if I'm a believer, the CMO, you know, needs to see the numbers. And that's where events have really faltered over the years. So I want to try to figure out what I can do to help bridge that gap to be both, you know, have a marketing mind and an event mind. And I've actually had the chance to do that the last couple of years with MPI. With the event strategist certification course, and try to give the skills to planners in order for them to get the recognition that they really deserve.
Well, it's really interesting that you say that, because I remember one of we were in the conversation with Tahira, we were kind of talking about how budgets are reconciled, and people were looking at food and beverage budgets being in the hundreds per person, where technology budgets can be $7 per person. And she was saying, in defense of the face-to-face meeting, that there's no faster way to do that business. But I suppose, based on what you're saying, it seems like there's a discord between the real practical benefit of being able to fill sales pipelines in person, and then the ability for that to translate into ROI metrics for the C-suite and your other stakeholders. So do you think that virtual and the pandemic in general has kind of changed the game in terms of the onus to demonstrate that ROI for live events?
I think it's going to contribute for sure. And I also think that hopefully what happens is that it becomes another point in the journey, and live events has a more specific place in that journey. Is kind of the exclamation point towards the accelerated trust. And the virtual event lives in a place of sustaining that trust or building towards it. I think those are the two directions, with a live event kind of being in the epicenter of it. I do believe that like the ROI that you can see from the virtual event ends up being a little bit easier to prove, because of the dollars spent are more on marketing parlance as opposed to F&B. I mean, food and beverage accelerates trust. It's true. Breaking bread is a thing. However, the quality of the food vis-a-vis the quality of the lead becomes very difficult to suss out mathematically. I think it could be done. I don't think that the hospitality mind is one of that hard ROI, and I think that's the disconnect. The disconnect is, I think you could run the numbers on that, truly. I mean, if you really wanted to do it. And I think that like some level of that is probably something that we should work more towards in order to make events not just something that when you have a good year and you do them, you continue doing them, but in fact, knowing the level of the value of it in order to know if you should be doing it more, differently, et cetera. And I think that like it just comes down to the mind of many in the basis of face-to-face events is one rooted in hospitality. In my opinion, that's just how I've been trying to see it over the last year. And virtual events / marketing have a little bit more of the DNA of hard ROI and of probably pipeline mentality. And I think the hospitality gene is smart because it knows if you treat people well, they'll take care of you, and that's true. But the difference is that that's sort of binary, and that doesn't work. You have to know scale. You have to be able to know how to scale, and you have to know if you can adjust the numbers in order to get more return on what you're doing. And just the sort of this works mentality isn't enough, I think. And I think maybe that's where virtual events will push them. I'm seeing it in other places too. I mean, you see it in certainly in retail, the idea of the sales experience happening in about a black and white way online, and then the experiential high touch and customer lifetime value being expressed in the brick and mortar. I think that some balance of that relationship will likely come to be over time, obviously at an accelerated pace than it would have prior to COVID in events.
Well, one thing I want to touch on, I mean, you said, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of the real value face-to-face events being that kind of breaking bread, in-person chemistry, ability to have the tangible, sensory experience. And I wanted to know, since Tahira's session is, basically about intentional design, how you think that factors into the design for a product like AllSeated, which is a 3D environment that tries to replicate that virtual space, because there's definitely like a running sentiment, and also one that we've published a few times, that you should treat the virtual environment as its own thing, create a dedicated experience that takes advantage of all the virtual has to offer. So, data-rich matchmaking services, AI-based recommendations, UX that leverages like familiar design elements and formats, so it's easier to onboard people. But AllSeated has, quite powerfully gone in the opposite direction to try and recreate that in-person experience. So can you shed some light on, the philosophy behind that approach and how you're trying to kind of bring together the best of both worlds in a virtual space?
Yeah, I mean, you are right in two areas very keenly. One, it's against all of those other sentiments that are very popular. And second, that it is ideological and philosophical as far as where it's coming from. One is that when I'm very much of this mindset too, when the marketplace is going in one direction, if you're a blue ocean person, you step back and you say, is there room for something else? As to not have to be, a red ocean player and have to just work on benefits and features. Like, is there room? Like, ultimately, I've said this out loud a number of times, which is my belief and the belief of, let's say, enough people at the organization, is that I believe that we are a niche solution. I also believe that the niche is potentially huge. And even outside of events, as events are seen. There's a lot of events, the majority of events that happen are not your traditional events. They're your internal events. They're your HR events and that kind of thing. And that's another area that we're going into, that will be in a world with more and more people who are not physically in the same place. A huge opportunity for us. But when it comes to specifically the traditional kind of B2B style events, the mindset is that we are hopefully offering something that is that sustaining or getting you excited for the face-to-face event, that fits with it. The core business of All Seated over the last 8 years has been providing tools for event professionals to design face-to-face events, the face live events. That's the majority of our clients are in that space. We're very committed to that. And I've always, just as my career has always been committed to intentionally designed experiences and live ones at that. We believe we're complementary. That said, the majority of the events that we're doing right now are in these spaces that are very similar to real spaces. In fact, based around and based on 3D scaled versions of our clients' venues from the All Seated Ops and Vision products. That isn't always the case and may eventually not be, but for right now, people are looking for the familiar. They're looking for something that they know how to navigate intuitively. We're in this period of time where giving people something that they know how to do, with as much friction as we get from people saying, well, my attendees, they're 55 and they don't know how to use a keyboard. And it's like, well, probably not. I think you're probably, most of the time, people underestimate people, for starters. But I will take the point that there's technology friction. We're trying to remove some of that friction by giving them a familiarity in spatial familiarity before we push the B2B crowd specifically into a more unfamiliar territory, of which we're perfectly set up to give them. So an example would be, we had a client that come to us and say, can you build us a yacht, just a whole 3-dimensional yacht where this happens in this room and this happens in this room, and it has this aesthetic. But the intentionally designed experiences is that you start everyone off looking over at the rooftop, looking down at this yacht. The next phase is that you're on the deck of the yacht, and then you have choices that you can go from either to this theater room, or you can network with people here. You can have conversations in here. But it was part of a thematic alignment with an internal campaign that they had. And we said, yeah, we can build the yacht. Of course, no problem. Now, that's not the typical experience that majority of B2B people have in trade shows and conferences. Therefore, most of the planners are not gravitating towards that kind of thing. But moving forward, when I think people's are more used to navigating these types of environments, I think that we're going to get a lot more requests for designing things whole cloth. And certainly the few that we've started with, as far as the SaaS clients who have a space that is their own to be able to put events at will, those are and will continue to be probably wholly designed from nothing. So that is a little bit less from the just giving them reality and just doing a faux reality, but in fact designing a reality for them, which hopefully bridges my interest into trade shows to take on whole-on activations, where instead of just a virtual 10 by 10 space, which frankly is it's what they want, but it's also as someone who wants to push things from the planner side to us, it's not that exciting, right? It could be so much more. I want them to be able to see those 10 by 10 booths as doorways into their own worlds, but which we can create. And as we build up our inventory of these worlds and these platforms and these design spaces, we'll have a much richer opportunity to give people something that is outside, clearly outside of what their expectations are. So it's less of a one-to-one faux trade show and more of something of its own kind.
That's fascinating. And I think what you were saying about underestimating the tech savoir of a particular age group is quickly becoming like a serious error to kind of labor under, because I'm, for example, in my late 30s. I grew up with video games. This is not at all an unfamiliar like
Right.
scenario for me to be in. It's very much the
It's
next generation
it's
of
Doom
business
1993,
professionals.
right? Like
Yeah.
it's honestly like a 30-year-old UX as far as familiarity, in my opinion, and yet we still experience people with that at one level. And I think it's just fear of technology that is maybe bred into planners' minds, because the technology world and the event world are diametrically different psychologically. One loves failure. One can't stand even the slightest failure. One never fails in technology as long as you keep making money. You just keep pivoting forever. And the other one feels like they have a pass fail. They have a specific day, and if that doesn't happen at that day, then you didn't do your job. And tech, there's no day. Every day is, I don't know what's going to happen today in my day. We could go a completely different direction, after this conversation. Don't know, right? And that's exciting for the, to some extent, marketers. I think somewhere sit in between, and the mind of technology. But for planners, like, they would much rather tell you that it has less excitement, less challenging, from a standpoint of challenging to the attendee, and would
They're
take
planners.
stability.
They want to make sure it works.
They think
right?
they're God, and by the way, they're asked to be. So it's not their fault. They're asked to be people who have to know everything, like about food and paint color
For
trends.
sure. But you'd only get one
Ridiculous.
chance to get an event right. Like,
Right.
it's like the doors open. If you're not ready, everybody's going to leave. They're not going to come in, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, just to build on that little bit, how do you work with planners to make them more open, perhaps, to doing something that's a little out of their comfort zone? Because I think what you're saying is, if you can go a little out of your comfort zone, you can do things that are way more interesting, that people get way more excited about, but you have to be willing to take a little bit of a risk. So how do you work with planners to be able to do that?
Outside of their comfort zone, and also potentially a higher lift if we're talking about designing whole new environments, right?
Yeah. And that depends exactly. The higher lift on the whole new environments really will be for the organizations that need that, right? And there's always those organizations. There's tons of them that want to be able to have that brand storytelling control. So while it is a heavier lift for some, like an association isn't going to do that likely, but a lifestyle brand would. Once we build up inventory of things like this, it becomes far cheaper and far easier for us to skin those and do variations of those in order to offer those. And so as we go, like, I know what we will have once we have more and more of a catalog of these options. But when it comes to like, I guess, are you like asking like how we sort of guide them? My answer is, I try to tell them why I think that they chose us, and I try to get it as concise as possible. So I would say, if you design an event with in All Seated Expo, you're going to want to embrace freedom and choice more than you're normally comfortable with. That whatever you plan for your attendees, know that they have their own plans and they're more valid. A friend of mine who is a planner for MGMA, which is a medical management association based out of Denver, she talks about designing for human collision. So the idea is to design opportunities at every path for there to be a choose your own adventure, how you define success to be at every corner. That's what I try to tell people is give them choice at every opportunity. A single track event for us is, we can do it, but it's like, kind of why, and I think that you need to be able to sit down in a room, and we've talked about this before too, but if you sit down in a room and if you don't like the presentation, you should be able to vote with your feet and go somewhere else and have something to do in order for every minute of your time on the platform to be valuable, because quality of engagement is the thing that I think is missing in most metrics for virtual events, and options of how that is, as opposed to quantity of engagement, which obviously there's a lot of data on, and that's how most of these things are scored. But I really believe that the choice and freedom bit will allow people to, as I've done a lot of attendee personas, know that there's not one successful path for an attendee. There's quite a few. So give them choice, I guess.
That's great. Nick, thank you so much for being with us and talking about this intentional event design and all the other things that Tahira talked about. I think this is an excellent addition to that conversation. And I hope to see you again on the podcast with us very soon.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Event Manager Podcast. Please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. For the latest news and the best articles on technology and innovation in the event industry, head over to eventmb.com.